The detective had been in law enforcement for 22 years, and he had never seen anything quite like what happened in the interview room in Galesburg, Illinois, on the afternoon of March 14, 2017. The man across the table was 79 years old. He had come in voluntarily. No attorney. He had driven himself from his retirement home in Peoria, 40 miles east, through a late winter sleet that had glazed the highway and made the drive slower than it should have been. He had parked his own car, walked in on his own 2 feet, and asked at the front desk if there was someone he could speak to about a cold case from 1979. He did not appear agitated. He did not appear relieved. He appeared, to the detective's eye, like a man completing a task he had assigned himself a very long time ago. His name was Gerald Marsh. He had coached varsity basketball at Galesburg High School for 18 years, and before that he had coached junior varsity, and before that he had been an assistant. And in the town of Galesburg he had been, for most of his adult life, the kind of man parents pointed out to their sons as someone worth looking up to. He had a room full of trophies. He had a wall of team photographs going back to 1971. He had, at his retirement party in 1999, received a standing ovation from 300 people that lasted long enough to make grown men wipe their eyes. He sat down across from the detective and folded his hands on the table and said, "I want to talk about Rosalie Tanner." Rosalie Tanner had been 17 years old. She had been dead for 38 years. And what Gerald Marsh said next would take 4 hours to say fully, and would ultimately produce both a guilty plea and a sentence, and the particular, devastating satisfaction of a family that had waited longer for truth than most people wait for anything. That is not a story about a confession that came too late to matter. That is a story about what a trusted man can do when an entire community has decided, without meaning to, not to look too closely at him. And what it took to reach that interview room, the family that had kept a 38-year vigil, the detective who reopened a file nobody had touched in a decade, and the man himself, whatever process had been running inside him all that time, begins not in 2017, but in the winter of 1979, in a town that believed it knew Gerald Marsh completely. Because to understand what was taken, you first have to understand who Rosalie Tanner was. Galesburg, Illinois, in the winter of 1979, was a working-class city of 35,000 people set out on the flat agricultural plain of Knox County. 2 hours west of Chicago, and a world away from it in every sense that mattered to the people who lived there. Carl Sandburg had been born there. The railroad had built it. The Maytag plant employed a good portion of it. In January and February, when the wind came off the open fields to the north and the temperature dropped below zero and stayed there, you could walk from one end of downtown to the other without seeing more than a handful of people. And those you did see were moving fast with their heads down, and everyone knew everyone they passed. Rosalie Tanner was a junior at Galesburg High School, 16 years old in January of 1979, 17 by March. She lived with her parents, Frank and Arlene Tanner, and her older brother Dennis, in a 2-story house on Pfeiffer Street, 4 blocks from the school. Her father worked at the Maytag plant. Her mother worked part-time at the public library, a job she loved and spoke about with a specificity of detail that her children found endearing. The particular smell of certain donated books, the regularity of certain patrons, the way the afternoon light fell across the reading room in late autumn. Rosalie was not an athlete. She was a student. She was the kind of student who found the work genuinely interesting, which is different from simply being good at it, and she was good at it too. Honors English, advanced history. A natural aptitude for argument that her English teacher, a woman named Ruth Albright, had noted in writing on her semester evaluation that fall. Ruth had written, "Rosalie has an unusual gift for identifying the detail that changes the meaning of everything else. She should pursue this." Ruth kept a copy of that evaluation in her own files for the next 40 years. Rosalie wanted to be a journalist. She had a subscription to the Chicago Tribune, paid for with her own babysitting money, and she read it every morning at the kitchen table before school, folding it open to the section she was working through, making small marks in the margins with a ballpoint pen. Her mother saved the issues she annotated. There was a stack of them by February of 1979, running halfway up the wall of the spare room. She had been the editor of the school paper since the fall semester. She took it seriously in the way she took most things, which was completely. That winter she had already filed 3 pieces she was proud of: a reported feature on the school's budget cuts, an interview with a retiring teacher, and a story about the locker room conditions that had produced an actual maintenance response from the district. She believed, in the specific way that 17-year-olds can believe things, that a story told carefully enough could change something. She had a best friend named Carol Hess, who lived 2 streets over, and with whom she had been inseparable since 6th grade. She had a habit of finishing other people's sentences, not rudely, just accurately, because she had been paying close attention. She wore her dark hair short, and she had a particular laugh, high and quick, that Carol said you could pick out of a crowded room from 20 feet away. She was the kind of girl who made her teachers think, without fully articulating it to themselves, that they were watching something that was going to go somewhere. Ruth Albright thought it every time Rosalie turned in a piece of writing. She thought it on the evening of February 23, 1979, at the basketball game, when she spotted Rosalie in the student section with her notebook out during a timeout. She raised a hand. Rosalie raised one back. That was the last time Ruth saw her. On the evening of Friday, February 23, 1979, Rosalie attended the Galesburg varsity basketball game against Peoria Manual. It was a rivalry game. The gym was full, and she was there in part because Carol's older brother was on the team, and in part because she was writing a piece for the school paper about the season. She had a small spiral notebook in her jacket pocket. She sat in the student section and took notes during timeouts. Gerald Marsh coached that game. His team won by 6 points. After the game, as the gym began to empty and the noise settled into the particular quiet of a locker room corridor, several students saw Rosalie walk toward the coach's hallway. She had told Carol she wanted to ask Coach Marsh a few questions for the article. Carol waited by the main doors. Rosalie never came back to the main doors. Carol Hess waited 45 minutes. She asked Dennis, who was helping break down the bleachers, if he had seen Rosalie come out. He had not. She checked the girls' restroom. Empty. She walked the perimeter of the gym twice. At 10:15 p.m., Carol went to find a teacher. By midnight, Frank and Arlene Tanner were at the school. Rosalie's coat was found the following morning in the equipment storage room adjacent to the coach's hallway, a room accessible from the corridor Rosalie had been seen entering. It was folded, not dropped. That detail, which the lead investigator noted carefully, and which would hover at the edge of the investigation for decades, suggested either that she had left it intentionally or that someone else had placed it there. The lead investigator was Detective Lou Piotrowski of the Galesburg Police Department. He was 38 years old, deliberate, experienced enough to know that the first 48 hours in a case like this were the ones that determined everything. He worked them hard. He interviewed every person who had been in the gym that evening. He interviewed Gerald Marsh twice within the first week. A cooperative. Visibly distressed Gerald Marsh, who said Rosalie had never come to see him, that he hadn't seen her after the game, that he wished to God he had, because maybe he could have done something. Rosalie's body was discovered 4 days later, on February 27th, in a drainage ditch off a rural road 8 miles south of Galesburg. She had been strangled. The medical examiner placed time of death within hours of the game's end. The spiral notebook from her jacket pocket was never found. Lou Piotrowski looked, systematically, at every man who had been in or near that gym on the evening of February 23rd. Gerald Marsh was on the list. Marsh gave a full account of his evening, the post-game meeting with his assistant coach, the drive home, the time of arrival confirmed by his wife. The alibi was not airtight, but there were no physical connections between Marsh and the crime. No witnesses who placed him with Rosalie, no motive Lou could establish beyond proximity. He noted Marsh's name and moved forward. He spent 14 months working the case before the investigation stalled. There was a man with a prior conviction for assault who had been seen near the school that night. Lou worked him hard, couldn't place him inside the building, couldn't bridge the gap. There was a rumor, never substantiated, about a man from Peoria who had attended the game as a supporter of the visiting team. Lou ran it to ground and found nothing. By 1981, the case had gone cold. Lou Piotrowski retired in 1993. He died in 2009. He had, his daughter said at his memorial, talked about Rosalie Tanner's case until the end of his life. By 1985, 6 years had passed, and Arlene Tanner had developed a discipline around grief that looked, from the outside, like composure, and was, from the inside, something harder to name. She kept Rosalie's room as it had been. Not as a shrine, she told people who asked. She was precise about the distinction, but because she had not yet decided what to do with it, and as long as she hadn't decided, it stayed. The Tribune subscriptions Rosalie had annotated were in a box in the closet. The spiral notebooks from school were in a separate box on the shelf. Arlene knew exactly where everything was. Frank Tanner had a different approach. He worked. He took extra shifts at the Maytag plant through most of the 1980s and spent his non-working hours in motion. The garden, the garage, the things that needed fixing. He wrote a letter to the Galesburg Police Department every year on the anniversary of Rosalie's death. He received a form letter in return for the first 3 years, and then nothing at all. And he kept writing anyway. Dennis Tanner moved to Rockford in 1984 to work at a machine shop and came back to Galesburg for Thanksgiving and Christmas and the February anniversary. He was the one who in 1994 submitted Rosalie's case to the Illinois State Police's Cold Case Unit and received a letter confirming that the case had been reviewed and that new investigative activity would depend on new evidence. He filed the letter and submitted again in 2001. Gerald Marsh retired from coaching in 1999. He received his standing ovation. He moved to Peoria with his wife. He attended church. He had grandchildren who visited. He appeared, to all who knew him in those years, to have entered retirement with the contentment of a man who had nothing on his conscience. The reward poster the Tanner family had placed in the Galesburg Register Mail in 1979 had long since lapsed. The gymnasium where Rosalie had been last seen was renovated in 2003. A new school paper had been running since 1982, and none of the students who worked on it knew that the girl who had come to interview a coach in that hallway had never come back out. By 2015, it had been 36 years. Arlene Tanner was 81 years old. Frank had died of a stroke in 2008, still writing his annual letters. She was in the house on Pfeiffer Street alone, which was the way she wanted it, close to her memories and close to where Rosalie had walked to school every morning for 3 years. Dennis called every Sunday evening, 7 o'clock, without fail. If you want us to keep finding the stories that almost got buried, like this one, please take a second to like and subscribe. Drop a comment and let us know where in the world you're watching from. It makes a difference. Now let's get back to Rosalie. The cold case unit detective who pulled Rosalie Tanner's file in 2016 was named Sandra Kell. She was 41, 11 years with the Illinois State Police, and she had come to the cold case unit from violent crimes with a specific conviction. That the older a case was, the more likely the investigation had stopped too soon. Not from negligence, from limitation. The tools available in 1979 were not the tools available in 2016, and neither were the social conditions under which witnesses felt safe speaking. She reread Lou Piotrowski's original reports over 2 evenings and came back to the same 2 points. First, the folded coat. The storage room adjacent to the coach's hallway had been processed for evidence in 1979, and nothing of forensic use had been recovered. But the coat had been folded. Lou had noted it and moved on. Sandra turned it over in her mind for a long time. Second, Gerald Marsh's alibi had been confirmed by his wife. Sandra ran every name on Lou's original canvas list through updated databases. She looked for behavioral flags, subsequent arrests, protective orders, anything that suggested the person had continued a pattern Lou had not been able to see. Nothing pointed sharply, but when she ran Marsh's name, she found something Lou Piotrowski had not had access to. A 1987 complaint filed against Marsh by a student's parent in Knox County, alleging inappropriate conduct with a minor. The complaint had been investigated internally by the school district and dismissed without police involvement. It had never appeared in any criminal database. Sandra found it in a box of archived district records held by the Knox County Administrative Offices. She requested an interview with Gerald Marsh in early 2017. He agreed. The interview was scheduled, and then, 2 days before it was set to happen, Marsh called Sandra's office and said he would not be needing the interview. He would like to come in on his own terms instead. He arrived on March 14th. He drove through the sleet. He sat down and folded his hands. What Gerald Marsh confessed to over the next 4 hours was that he had spoken with Rosalie Tanner in the equipment storage room on the evening of February 23, 1979. He had agreed to answer her questions for the article. He said that during the conversation, he had acted in a way he knew at the time was wrong, and that he had, when she resisted, acted further in a way that ended with her death. He said he had placed her coat in the storage room himself, intending it to look like she had left of her own accord. He said he had driven her in the trunk of his car to the ditch off Farm Road 9 south of town. He had told no one. He had come to believe over the years that his initial assessment, that nothing would ever connect him to the crime, had been correct. And then Sandra Kell had requested an interview, and he had understood, in a way he could not fully explain to anyone, that it was time. The town of Galesburg received the news of Gerald Marsh's arrest with a silence before the outrage. There were people who had cheered his teams in that gymnasium for 28 years. There were men in their 50s who had played for him, who had carried lessons he'd given them into their adult lives, who sat down when they heard the news and could not stand up again for a while. The trophies in the trophy case were still there. The wall of team photographs was still there. And every person who looked at those photographs now saw something they had not been able to see before, because it had been wearing the right face for a very long time. Gerald Marsh entered a guilty plea in the fall of 2017. He was sentenced to 40 years, a term that, given his age, amounted to a life sentence. He offered no public statement. His attorney spoke for him, briefly. The words were not remembered. Dennis Tanner drove from Rockford to Galsburg for the sentencing. He sat in the first row. He had called their mother from the courthouse steps and held the phone up for a moment so she could hear. She was 92 now, too fragile to travel, still in the house on Pfeiffer Street. And Arlene Tanner said nothing for a long time and then said, "Tell her we didn't forget." Rosalie Tanner's English teacher from Galesburg High School, a woman named Ruth Albright, who was 84 years old by the time of the conviction, gave a statement to the Galesburg Register Mail that read, in part, "I told her she was going to do something important. I believed that when I said it. I still believe it. She did something important. It just took 38 years to matter the way it was supposed to." Rosalie Tanner was 17 years old. She read the Chicago Tribune over breakfast and annotated the articles that made her think. She could pick out the detail in any argument that everyone else had missed. She had a notebook in her jacket pocket and a question she had gone to ask, and the man she had trusted enough to ask it used that trust to destroy her. A coach is, by definition, someone a young person is taught to listen to. The trust that title carries is real and ordinary and right. What Gerald Marsh did with it is the full measure of his crime, not just the act, but the 38 years of standing ovations he took, while a family sat in a house on Pfeiffer Street and waited for what he already knew. The trophies were still winning, the teams were still cheering, and somewhere in the stands, in all those years of noise, the truth was sitting perfectly still, wearing his name, waiting for someone to finally ask the right question. It did not come soon enough for Rosalie. It did not come soon enough for Frank Tanner, who died still writing his annual letters, or for the years Arlene spent alone in a house that never moved on because she could not bring herself to let it. But it came. Justice found Rosalie Tanner 38 years after she was killed. Stories like hers are why this channel exists. If you believe that no amount of standing ovations should be enough to buy a man's silence forever, subscribe. More cases are waiting in the description. Thank you for being here. What do you think? Does a confession, however late, change the moral weight of what Gerald Marsh did? Or does 38 years of silence make it worse? What does it say about the way we extend trust to authority figures that a complaint filed in 1987 never reached law enforcement? And what do you make of the fact that he confessed only after Sandra Kell requested an interview? Was that calculation or conscience? Leave your thoughts in the comments.